This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 472 of the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast. In this week's episode, it's like the day before brewing industry Christmas, or maybe we could call it like CBC Eve. I hope all of you all listening will also be in Philly for CBC. You'll also come out to our live podcast event Monday night, April 20th at Union Transfer. Tickets are available at cbblive.beerandbrewing.com. And if you just haven't grabbed one yet, but you've been meaning to, you can just drop me a line, jbogner@beerandbrewing.com. I'll send you the code for a free ticket. It's going to be a great time, and we want all of you there to enjoy it with us. Of course, Vinny Chilurzo of Russian River, Kelsey McNair of North Park, Evan Price of Green Cheek will be there, along with special guest Ben Edmonds of Breakside and more. We'll have some Russian River beer on draft. We'll take your audience questions, and it promises to be both educational and entertaining and thirst-quenching all at the same time. This week's episode is a bit of a departure for the podcast. It's an interview our executive editor Joe Stange recorded last week with Scotty Hargrave, formerly of Australia's Balter Brewing, and Blake Masoner of Craft Coast, who you've heard in the podcast before. We didn't really intend for it to be a podcast episode, and it was not recorded as such. But as Joe is reporting for his upcoming feature on XPA in the next issue of Craft Beer and Brewing, he recorded this conversation, and we just felt like we had to share it with you. It's, in fact, he recorded a much longer conversation than the amount that we're sharing with you. But it was so good. We just wanted to get it out there. Scotty's somebody I've been meaning to have on the podcast for ages, and Joe beat me to it. But the real winners are you all who get this peek into the behind-the-scenes work we put into every story that goes into Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, the Brewing Industry Guide, Spirits and Distilling, and all of that. We'll jump into their conversation on XPA in a minute. But first, the Craft Brewers Conference is coming up in just a few days, April 20th through 23rd. And G&D Chillers will be there. If you're heading to CBC, swing by and talk shop with the folks who know brewery operations inside and out. G&D's biggest strength isn't just the equipment, it's their deep understanding of how a brewery runs. From cellar layout to production flow, their team brings decades of hands-on experience to every install and every conversation. Whether you're running a single-stage 5H unit or scaling up with a vertical air chiller, G&D builds systems that are reliable, efficient, and built to last. Because when your chiller's solid, your beer stays cold, and your operation stays on track. Plan your visit at gdchillers.com/podcast and come to see them at CBC booth 1518. And Berkeley Yeast just launched Dry Tropics London, their best-selling liquid yeast strain, now with all the ease-of-use benefits of dry yeast. Dry Tropics London delivers the soft, pillowy mouthfeel and juicy character you'd expect from a top-tier London ale strain, but with a serious upgrade. A burst of thiols that unleash vibrant, layered notes of grapefruit and passion fruit. A lot of brewers love the clean passion fruit you get from Tropics, but they don't want every IPA to be a tropical fruit bomb. At the dry yeast price point, you can pitch and ditch without breaking the bank, or you can co-pitch with your house strain to adjust the intensity of the notes. And with nationwide free shipping, there's never been a better time to try Dry Tropics. Order now at berkeleyyeast.com and experience the ease and impact of Dry Tropics London yeast. Also, this episode is sponsored by PackTech, delivering craft beer multi-packing you can trust. PackTech's handles are made from 100% recycled plastic and are fully recyclable, helping breweries close the loop and advance the circular economy. With a minimalist design, durable functionality you can rely on, and custom color matching, PackTech helps brands stand out while staying sustainable. Trusted by craft brewers nationwide, they offer a smarter, sustainable way to carry your beer. To learn more, visit packtech-opi.com. That's PAKTECH-OPI.com. All right, here's Joe Stange's conversation on XPA with Scotty Hargrave and Blake Masoner.
All right, I appreciate you guys making the time for me. This is actually, I'm going to make Jamie jealous because this should be a panel podcast, really. Should be the XPA deep dive craft beer brewing podcast. But I'll have a recording, so if he wants to use it, maybe he can do it.
The Maestro and the Sensei.
That's it. Scotty, what are you doing now? now that you left Balter last year.
Yeah.
Are you brewing? Are you enjoying your time? What are you doing?
I guess you'd call it a gap year, I guess. I don't know. People go, oh, you're retired now, blah, 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 and I sort of go, I don't know, that just makes me sound really old or, over the hill or whatever. But, yeah, I'm not actively brewing at the moment. Doing a lot of mowing. My wife and I bought a farm last year, a little bit further into the Byron Bay hinterland, where we've sort of lived for a long time, and yeah, just out here hanging with the wild animals.
Good. Okay.
Lots of them. My wife does a bit of wildlife rescue, so we're very lucky. Like I heard at 5 a.m. this morning, I heard wallabies bouncing along our back veranda, and we've got a koala just out here in the tree, like 20 meters away, and it's a really cool spot. We got 165 acres here, so I've still got all the original, my home brewing kit that I developed XPA on way back in the day over in a shed. So at some point I'll dust that off and.
Yeah, good. Actually, I want to talk about that. And speaking of Byron Bay too, let's go back in time. Was it 2015, 2014 when you were developing that? Even though you're brewing those medal-winning lagers at Byron Bay, you're coming home and firing up this thing and working on this XPA thing. Where did that sort of idea for that come from? Because I know I think there were other XPAs in Australia then, but maybe not.
There was, well, really for me, it was sort of at the end of, really in the last sort of 6 months or so of my time at Stone and Wood. So I was their first full-time employee, and we, as you get into sort of 2013, Stone and Wood were expanding. They were going up to another site, like an hour's drive north of where we live. And I wasn't real keen on sort of doing that when I lived so close to the brewery and whatnot. And I guess they kind of outgrew me in one way and I kind of outgrew them in another. So I ended up at Byron Bay and was brewing there. And my ultimate aim was to try and buy the equipment off the owner and start my own thing, but he didn't want to sell it. But anyway, at the end of that sort of last few months of the Stone and Wood period and into the Byron Bay period, I was still brewing at home and on weekends, and I was just dabbling and trying to make some different beers to what I was doing at work, and I just ended up wanting, I started to see the Citras and Mosaics and all these sort of newer American hops sort of make their way to Australia, but we weren't really using a lot of them. Like Stone and Wood was just all about Galaxy, obviously, and at one point I was probably throwing more Galaxy in more tanks than anybody else on the planet, so I wasn't looking to brew with that so much, but I was starting to see some of these newer hops and I didn't really have an outlet for it except at home. So I was trying to make a beer that for myself really that had this sort of new school hop character and be able to express it, all those newer characters. And, I was looking for a beer that was manageable, I didn't want to make a 6 or 7% IPA because I wanted to make a beer that I could drink, and drink in quantity, I suppose. And, it was all about trying to balance that saturated hop flavor from all these new hops that as I started to play with them, I started to be able to massage them into really sort of tropical, characters, flavors and aromatics and stuff that really works here with our climate as well, so it was all about, it's kind of just an exercise for me at home really can I make a beer that has all of this great new school hop flavor to it, but not be overwhelming and have the bitterness like balanced, but still punchy and allow the beer to clean up nicely and be refreshing and, sit in a manageable ABV for our climate and, our drink driving laws and all of those sorts of things. So, that's where sort of XPA came into being for me. And you're right, there were a couple of examples here in Australia, but they were, from memory at the time, there was a couple of Melbourne-based breweries that had beers labelled XPA, but they were much more in the, I guess these days you'd call it like American strong pale sort of, region. They were much more sort of 6%-ish beers, very high 6%, low sixes, much more copper coloured, probably a bit of crystal malt driven.
Yeah,
using older,
more extra than pale.
Yeah. But for me, XPA always meant extra pale, and that's why, I kept this one really lean and clean and dry and light in color, really, again, like it's, climate played a big part in that. Having a beer that was, allowed this hop expression and experience, I suppose, but not just bash you around and overwhelm you. And because in summertime up here, like when it's 100 degrees F or something and 98% humidity, it can be you can get walloped pretty easy if you're drinking really big beers.
I think that climate connection is interesting, and also the laws there. I mean, the drink driving, but also the excise taxes, right?
Yeah.
I'm kind of, what do you see as maybe the ABV range of an XPA, and I'm kind of, how do those other things feed into that?
For mine, it was always around that 4.5 to 5, maybe 5.5%. Any more than probably 5.2, 5.5, and the beer gets a bit bigger. It probably is maybe getting it into strong pale sort of territory. I mean, we had one at Balter for a couple of years, a strong pale that I deliberately brewed. It wasn't XPA, with a bit more booze in it. It was much more a classic American strong pale, and won trophies and stuff, and was a real favourite of Australian. I had lots of brewer friends here sending me photos. They'd be drinking it on the beach or whatever all the time. But the public didn't buy it, so we put it to sleep eventually.
Thinking about on the climate thing too, and I was looking at some of these older extra pale ales in the States. One that I remember, because I was homebrewing extra pales like around 2012, not very well, but I remember what inspired me was Odell St. Lupulin, because they had extra pale ale on there, but that's 6% or 6.5%, something like that.
And Deschutes used to do one as well, right? That was XPA, but which meant experimental pale ale. So every year they'd whack something out that was, again, probably, on the low range of an IPA more than anything else.
Blake, you might remember the AleSmith X.
Yeah,
that was an extra pale ale of like 2010 maybe, but that's
So.
And that's also that was golden-ish, and maybe that's a climate thing, because that's San Diego, right? That was always kind of the San Diego style, dry and pale.
Yeah, it was a little bit different, I guess, from what the realm of what XPA is to this day. AleSmith X was one of the originals, just like, Scotty's talking about the originals of Australia. There was original XPA of California and Southern California. Like AleSmith X was there, but it was like 6%, little malt driven. Up in NorCal, there was the Steelhead XPA from Mad River. That was like that was the very first XPA I ever drank. Completely different. It was 6%. Extra pale in that realm was a bigger pale ale. It wasn't necessarily a lighter, more hop driven pale ale. It was just more pale ale, which was strong pale essentially. Once I started working at Pizza Port, they made a pretty strong differentiation of pale ale, strong pale ale, West Coast IPA. Like there was 3 different beers there. And then when Scotty and the Balter crew came over and we met for the first time. That was when Extra Pale really changed, differentiated itself from 3 different beers and just kind of made one actual purposeful beer out of all these different pails. And that's what, I mean, essentially that's what drove this conversation today, is what happened in between
Definitely
all of those beers.
I mean, I think it's well established in the canon that Scotty reinvented XPA. Like, Balter XPA popularized it, right? I mean, even Cooper's had to brew an XPA a couple years later, right?
They did, so that was pretty funny. Like, it's actually quite, it was really funny actually that in response to our beer, you know, to my little beer that Cooper's ended up brewing one of their own, which was, you know, Coopers are like that heritage brand here. I mean, a lot of US brewers, the first Australian craft beer, if you like, or non-multinational industrial lager they've ever heard of has been a Cooper's beer. So that was pretty gratifying. But, you know, again, at one point there, I can remember there was like an Australian sort of beer media here, and somebody was asking, while I was still developing mine, you know, someone was sort of asking, what does XPA mean? Because of these US examples and stuff. And there were a couple, and it was very much, oh, well, it's just, who knows, it's just a slightly underpowered IPA or something, or whatever it might be. And I can remember, you know, with all the dabbling I was doing and all the sort of experimentation I was doing, I'd read this article somewhere, and I just, in my mind, I said, I'm going to show you what an XPA means. It's this thing I'm sort of playing with. And I just had that thought, forgot about it, just got on with it, blah, 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 blah. But when we got Balter together, you know, that became, I knew that was going to be the flagship beer for us, this one I'd been developing at home. And I really tested out that recipe, and it became quite bomb-proof, you know. It scaled up from 50 litres to 500 litres to, you know, 4,000 litres to 6,000 litres to, you know, over the last 18 months when I was at Balter, we actually moved some of it up to Yadler. Yadler is the largest, I think, the largest commercial brewery in Australia. Like, it's a 800 hectolitre brew length. And we did some cross brewing up there, and you know, as the brand owner, I suppose, they had to jump through a fair few hoops. They had to spend a lot of money on being able to build a dry hopping system, you know, and this giant brewery that had never made remotely hoppy beers ever, you know. It had mostly been about, you know, post-fermentation, bittering and all this sort of stuff, because I'm making industrial lagers. But even at an 800 hectolitre brew length, you know, this recipe worked.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one of those things, I suppose, you know. It was.
We'll be back with more of the conversation in a minute, but first, taste the flavors of indie hops at CBC this year in Philly. 14 incredible beers will showcase Strata, Luminosa, Lorient, Audacia, plus their most promising new experimental hop, IH19082, in a single hop XPA. Of course it is. So on theme for this episode. Experience their newest hop, Audacia, in an IPA by Grand Fir, a hoppy lager by Meanwhile, and a hazy by Worthy Brewing. Explore the wonders of Strata and IPAs from Odell, Russian River, and Grains of Wrath and Grand Fir. Refresh your palate with the crisp, summery flavors of Lorient and an Italian Pils by Sun River and a Mexican lager by Holdout. And bask in the liquid sunshine magic of Luminosa with an IPA from Fort George. Check out the full CBC beer lineup at www.indiehops.com and plan to stop by their booth number 926. They'll be as happy to see you as you will be that you made the effort, and you may just find me there sampling the beers as well. Can't wait to try some of these indie hops. Life is short. Let's make it flavorful. And if you're like many podcast listeners, you've got a lot of beers at home and your regular fridge is at capacity. Enter the Midea 50/50 Flex, the industry's first dual compartment, 3-way convertible freezer. Here is what all of that means for you. Options: The 50/50 has the power to be all freezer, all fridge, or a little bit of both, but you'll probably want to use those 20 cubic feet as a massive garage-ready beer fridge. You can also change which side the door is on or how you want the shelves to be arranged. The 50/50 totally flexes to fit your life. Plus, it's designed to maintain a stable temperature even in non-climate controlled conditions, so you can crack a cold one even on the warmest days in the man cave. Take your garage to the next level. Check out midea.com/US to get more info about this game changer today. And the Beyond Beer space is booming, and Old Orchard is here for it, supplying brewers with fruit ingredients for all of your beverage needs. Low, no alcohol, hard lemonades, seltzer, cider, and more. Old Orchard has supplied hundreds of industrial customers across 49 states, including nationally and internationally loved brands, so you'll be in good company. More information and free samples are waiting at oldorchard.com/brewer. That's oldorchard.com/brewer. Now, back to the conversation on XPA.
What would you say, just to take a step back for a second, like what would you say are the pillars of an XPA? Like when you taste someone else's, you're like, yeah, that's an XPA, versus another one where you were like, well, that's not really what I would call an XPA. What do you think are those like few key things that need to be there?
I guess like if I base it off the template of mine, it's going to have initially like a soft aromatic, a soft mouthfeel. That tropical character comes out, really quickly. It's going to have a great hoppy mid palate, and it's probably, I think it comes down to how I actually hop the beer, but it's going to have a very even, consistent hop flavor and aroma right across the palate, but it's going to finish dry and clean and snappy and just leave you wanting another mouthful. And it's going to leave you like with a really nice hop experience without fatiguing your palate at all, which is, I think it's quite a balancing act. So for me, it's a beer that has that initial sort of lush, delicious hop character that manages to keep consistent across the palate. There's no dips or hollows in it, and cleans up nice. I mean, one philosophy that I've always had about it, and this is how I developed the recipe, because it's where my sort of brewing instincts lie and where my development came from, really, is you think of it as a really modern pale ale, but using German processes, I suppose, like a German sort of brewing mindset to it. Because XPA, the way I've made it's always been step mashed. It's first wort hopped. The kettle additions are really, really important, and that they're not just, you don't just dump 3 bags in a whirlpool at the end of it and call it done. It's much more measured than that. It's like, if it's 600 grams of Citra, it means 600 grams, not half a bag or a bag just because. So it was more about that sort of, how do I make a really modern, drinkable, Southern Hemisphere, tropical, for our climate, sort of, hoppy beer, but use, German brewing precision and attitude and attention to detail and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's why mine worked out. And
yeah,
I think when I think of an XPA like that, I think that's what I get, is that initial, like that sort of generous, hoppy, rounded mouthfeel that takes you on a bit of a journey across the palate, but dries out and almost has like a lagery finish to it. And that was one of the things really early on that people would be saying to me, it's like this tropical session IPA that finishes like a lager, and again, you can't disconnect it from the influence of the climate that I created this beer in. That's where I live, is in the subtropics of northern New South Wales, and it really is part of that. If I'd have been trying to make this beer in Scotland or somewhere, it might have been a bit different.
Sure. Blake, is there anything you want to add to that?
When he says climate driven in Australia, you think about that's the east coast of Australia, which is kind of a mirror image of the West Coast of the United States. San Diego, California is always nice. We're driven by West Coast IPA, driven by lighter style, I guess, Latin American influence lager. And it's like, all right, well, when I had that beer, it changed my mind because I was drinking, we were taking the 7.5% West Coast IPA and just trying to shrink it to 6.5 and 6%, 6.2, just trying to get every bit of drinkability out of it. And then the Balter XPA, when I had that beer for the first time, I was like, okay, I need to reverse engineer this thing in my own brain. But I know the guy that makes it. So I could ask him how to do it, or I'll reverse engineer it and then ask him what he thinks of it after that's done. And it probably took a solid 8 or 10 renditions of reverse engineering before it's like, we align on this is what an XPA actually is. And then once it landed there, I was happy with it. I really liked it. And
So was I.
just kind of,
Killed it,
yeah.
mate.
Killed it. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
then,
just
and
kind
then
of
you,
stuck to that. But
then you won a bronze
I
medal
looked
at
up-
World Beer Cup, and then a silver medal the next year.
yeah, it's
Must
so
be
I
some-
think that's a good nod to understanding what the style is, where it came from, why it is, why the guy made it in the first place.
Hey Joe, I got to tell you, there was I guess with I've judged in the US a lot of years, GABF, World Beer Cup, or all that sort of stuff, and there were around that sort of time that the bloke's talking about, they, I guess because I'm Australian and with the XPA thing, and there are a few people knew about it, like I'd show up at GABF or World Beer Cup and they're like, all right, well, you're judging, the medal rounds of Australian Pale Ale, because I was part of a group of, I think, 3 or 4 other people that rewrote the style guidelines for Australian Pale Ale back around 2017 or so, I think it was. And the BA adopted it straight away. So the very first US comp that I judged after that, I think it might have been GABF in 17 or 18 or something. They're like, all right, well, you're judging Australian Pale Ale. And I remember like talking to Blake at his pub, and he goes, I'm going to put a beer in Australian Pale Ale. And the only thing is I'd always entered XPA as International Pale Ale. But anyway, and he goes, I got one. And he goes, I've sent it off. I went, so tell me about this beer. And he goes, well, it's 6.2% alcohol. I went, if I see that shit on my table, I'm going to throw it off straight away. So, you know what? I think Blake's greatest success when it comes to brewing XPA is like everything I've told him, he just completely ignores it and does the exact opposite thing. And really well.
No,
I couldn't be more proud of the guy. Like he's killed it. Like he's yeah. It's been 2024. I think late 24 was the last time I was actually got to stand in the pub at Oceanside or down at the new one. But yeah, no, Blake certainly. More than any, like, I've got a bunch of friends over there who've all made different, their own interpretations of XPA, and, I've obviously had to try a lot of them, but most of those folks are really getting it. But Blake really has got the, I think he's managed to get the whole intention of the beer into the beer itself, Mm-hmm. Regardless of how he might get there, he's got that intention right, and that's why it's done so well. And I'm just stoked for him to see that beer do so well for him, because he gets why I made it in the first place. And as you say, Southern California is a pretty good place to be drinking those sorts of beers as well.
Yeah, I really
And the
wanna-
last time I had it at San Marcos, I think it was like, I think he also had Chilsner on tap, and it must have been
another medal winner.
would that have been before GABF, Blake? Did you get medals there as well? 24?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Chilsner as well, wasn't it? Because I remember both those beers are just on fire then, and I was like, we must have been over. Yeah, it would have been Hop Harvest,
Mm-hmm.
all that sort of stuff. But yeah, like, Blake's really, he's really sort of taken the ball and run with it. It's great. It's great to see. It's very rare, over the last 10, 20, approaching 30 years of craft beer, I suppose. Like over here, Australia's almost always been on the receiving end of what's going on in craft beer around the world. And it's kind of, there's a little bit of Aussie pride in the fact that at least, with XPA, it's sort of gone back across the Pacific, back that way, where there's, sort of influence from, mine and some of the others here that have, been able to sort of influence things over in the US a bit, especially when you see some of the big guys like Matt like Matt Brennelson at Firestone's a very good friend of mine, but to see Firestone making an XPA, and I saw that Sierra Nevada did one not too long ago. I don't know much about that one, but I've had people from all around the world, France, sending me beer and saying, "Hey, what do you think of this? We're making one of these beers." It's like it's pretty cool that it has traveled that far. So,
Right. Yeah.
More in a minute, but first, today's episode is brought to you by ADM. Are you ready to shake up the beverage world? ADM is passionate about helping you craft your next breakthrough. From cutting-edge natural ingredients like hops to advanced technologies, ADM brings together science and creativity to elevate taste, quality, and recipe design. Whether you're developing a beer innovation or a bold new flavor experience, ADM is your trusted partner in innovation. Let's create something extraordinary, because the future of beer and brewing starts with inspired ideas and exceptional expertise. ADM is where nature meets precision. Learn more at adm.com/alcohol. And running a brewery means juggling a lot, managing production, serving guests, selling online, and keeping everything moving behind the scenes. That's where Arrived comes in. What started as a point-of-sale system has grown into the technology your brewery runs on, built specifically for the teams behind great beer. Unlike generic systems, Arrived brings together taproom service, online sales, brewery management, payments, reporting, and growth tools into one complete platform. So instead of bouncing between systems, you can brew, serve, and sell all in one place. See it in action at CBC 2026, booth 1626, or visit Arrived, ARRYVED.com to learn more. Also, pumps are critical to any advanced homebrewing setup, from mash recirculation to wort transfer, and even for cleaning. A quality pump is a key part of every brew day. The SS Brew Pump from SS Brewtech is engineered to tackle even the messiest brew days, featuring an IP55 water resistance rating, an easy-to-use DIN head with 360-degree rotation, and a flow rate of up to 11 gallons per minute. It has the power to keep your brew day moving. Visit www.ssbrewtech.com/pump to learn more about how the SS Brew Pump can upgrade your home brewery. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
I want to talk about hops, and I really want to talk about water too. But first, let's talk about the malt. I think that may be the easiest thing to explain, perhaps. We're talking extra pale, kind of like a Pilsner-like base to it. Anything else you'd want? I mean, you're talking about a step mash, just attenuation as well.
I sourced some malt that's grown in Australia, and that's what XPA is built on. And now that's what a lot of the beers are built on. But for sure, XPA started that whole trend. And now that base malt has taken on basically every brand at Craft Coast that's a ale, somewhat derives from that.
So what do you? So that's surprising, because I've heard some Australian brewers say they prefer malt from other places to necessarily Australia. So I'm curious about what the Australian based malt, and when we can talk brand suppliers if you want. What they're
Yeah,
bringing
sure.
to the table that maybe you're not getting from, domestic US two-row.
The thing about the thing about XPA, like when I was first brewing it, like I was still using the pale malt, we call it, or base malt from work, right? So that was usually Barrett's pale malt. So and they do a Pilsner malt too, but you'll find by and large Australian barley varieties are really, really really high attenuators normally. So they have, a fair bit of protein in them. They're often grown in fairly dry, conditions as well. And so you do see sometimes, the protein will get a bit higher when it's really dry and can affect haze and stuff. But like they do, like the DPs are really, really high on them, and often like in the 10 years that I was sort of bolted there, like, it'd be very, very common to have a DP over 300, sometimes over 350 for Australian pale malts. So they're really hot, we would call them. So they convert really quick, and they've got so much diastatic power they'd convert a cardboard box. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these varieties were developed, for the Asian like super dry beer markets, and I think over the year there used to be one called Galaxy before the Hop Galaxy came out as well, and it was, as a homebrew, I remember like, it was very complete conversion and stuff. And, when you're a budding home brewer, like attenuation's not always, as complete as you'd like it to be. And having malts like that helped you have fully fermented, drier, crispier, snappier beers. And, it's a function of like with the climate. I mean, it's what we've got here. And like any beer style that has any sort of lasting impact will be a result of the conditions it's made in and what ingredients you can get your hands on. And like Blake said, the foundation of it all is that malt. So, so XPA had, Australian pale malt, like I said, that, very high DP, like really high attenuation. I'd often have to, I developed that recipe to the point where I'd have to temper it a bit with a bit of, usually a bit of Munich malt, a bit of carapils, to stop it being like so dry and thin that it became harsh or a bit bony or whatever, and a good whack of Australian wheat malt as well. So, and initially, like the Munich and the carapils were often Weirmann, German.
Yeah,
as well.
But you also mentioned step mashing. So was that to get even more attenuation out of it, or is there also another purpose to the foam retention?
Well, part of it for me is like I like to mash in around 52C. I like to start around there because I know a lot of people would talk about how it might damage head retention, but I think it works the other way around. I think always found it very beneficial. So, a typical one would be sort of 52 to 53, 66. I'm going to talk in C here, 66 to 68, depending on how hot it was. A rest at 72 to 73, and then a mash out at 77. And again, it was because as a home brewer, I just wanted that sort of German discipline of brewing step mash beer. So I'd have to make boiling water infusions because I just had a Gatorade mash tun thing, and I got very good at being able to put boiling water infusions and kind of make a pseudo decoction mash, by using, starting with very thick mash at those low temperatures, at protein rest temperatures, and then thinning the mash right out because I had to get the temperatures to change with boiling water. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, it just worked ridiculously well. So And I think having that step program helped with the fermentation profile. I think it helped with the haze level, with the stability. Yeah, I think there was good reasons to do it. We always have, and continues to this day.
And I think yeast. I mean, are we talking Chico, or could you do an XPA with lager yeast? Do you have thoughts on that? I know you want a clean profile.
I think you could probably do the whole 3470 thing with it for sure. It only ever happened at Balter, once or twice, which was an accident. It was a mistake where, we were using bricks of US-05 and one of the guys chucked in a bunch of lager yeast, and because we weren't doing that intentionally, the beer didn't turn out the way we wanted it to. So that one probably went down the sink, I'd say. But you definitely could. And I mean, we can't get the GM yeast over here, but, I know I'd spoken to Laura Burns at Amiga previously about using the diacetyl-free version of American ale yeast and stuff. So I think that could be the beauty of, the next iterations of where XPA might go to here. Could be, what if you've got a house yeast that you think's particularly suitable for something like that? Yeah, why not? Why not? But yeah, initially it was all about US-05 because it was so consistent for us. And even though, we started with a 30-barrel brew house, when it was just myself and one or two other guys there, I had to get the beer really consistent really quickly, and using dried yeast was a great way to do that. We didn't have to worry about yeast health so much or cell counts or anything. You're meant to throw four blocks into this tank, so if you do that, you should be good. So, and it got us a long way, in the later years at Balter. Then we had a very very well equipped lab. So, we, eventually developed a program where we were propagating and repitching yeast, and, which when you're making, 20 or 30 million liters of beer a year, then, every extra hour of tank residency time matters somewhere. So, we were able to move beyond that. But yeah, US-05 is a great start. So
yeah. Blake, you had any thoughts on yeast or malt fermentation?
US-05 500-gram bricks go a long way, and it turned out that XPA is a really good starting point for that yeast when it comes down to building up from a 5% beer to, our 7.5% West Coast IPAs that are kind of become the core. And then even people really dig our strong stuff. We can do like 10.5% triple IPAs and stuff. But XPA starts our generation most oftentimes, and it's so consistent, I think that beer is like 11.5 Plato. We can expect 1.8 to 2 Plato every time. And it's just the perfect yeast for what we're trying to accomplish. And then, I was kind of mentioning earlier the malt foundation, just like with anything, you kind of got to be a student of the game. And, if I'm going to brew something that's based on a particular beer from a particular region, I want to research it and get as much as the agriculture and as much as the style that I could possibly get with the materials that are available to me in Southern California. So like, obviously US-05 as a fermentable is the foundation point, sourcing some Australian grown barley of any kind. In our case, it's a Pilsner malt, and then throwing in a bit of wheat. Always, that helps with the head retention. We're single infusion on both brew houses. can't do much more than that with what we have, but that's been tried and true. Yeah, I think one of the great parts, which Scotty mentioned, is the malt that's grown there just has this this DP that'll get you from where you're expecting to start to where you want to finish, and it's pretty consistent, which is why it's made that beer so popular for us. It's like you get all the hops, but then you get a beer that finishes bone dry like a lager, and then you're like, all right, I need another sip of that, and next thing you know, you're drinking 3 or 4 hoppy beers, and you don't even get fatigue of the hop because the beer is just so in harmony with everything.
Didn't you say you're also using that now for your West Coast IPAs and other beers too? I think it's fascinating that you might adopt like Australian base malts for West Coast on the West Coast.
Yeah, luckily, I'm a brew pub, glorified brew pub, even our core beers, whatever. But yeah, tried a million different base malts, and then once I got a hold of the XPA malt, then it kind of turned into one of those things. All right, let's move some of those West Coast IPAs to that, and now consistently across the board, we're drier, we're more drinkable. We could even tone the recipe down, by like trim a bag off because we're just expecting that much more dry of a beer. In addition to just having more equipment at our new brewery, like simple stuff like flow meters and RO water systems and blending stations, like it all kind of adds to this, but at the same time, it kind of derived from XPA being a beer that we can really lean on and just look at for water to grist ratios, pounds per barrel, and hops, hot side, cold side, attenuation. It all has trickled upwards from a small beer into West Coast IPA. So it's like, it's really cool.
Yeah, we've talked for quite a while, and this article, after all, is for the hops issue, the IPA issue, and we haven't talked about hops. So I think we got to talk about hops. And Scotty,
do we even need to talk about hops? It's all about the malt, bro.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of is, and I think you guys established that very well, actually. Scotty, earlier you mentioned getting at the back of the decade ago or more, getting excited about some of the US varieties that were coming in and wanting to play with those. Of course, and you also mentioned tropical character in these beers too. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if the tropical character is required or if maybe there's some room for creativity there. But I think that's kind of interesting. Like, where do we go with sort of? I mean, we're talking New World hops, but are we talking Northern Hemisphere or Southern or some of both? And what's this? What do you see as sort of the how much room is there for personality in the hop character of an XPA?
I think there's a fair bit. I think you're always going to have. I think that XPA, as I know it, is always going to be at its best when it has, a fruity character. I mean, a big part of mine was also balancing a perfumey floral character with the tropical character. So, an XPA, had Amarillo and Centennial and, Mosaic and Citra and I'll keep it as my little X factor as well, a German bittering hop. So, I've seen lots of people send me what they think XPA is all about and how you do it. And it's like, well, it's at one point it's a lot simpler than you think it is, but in another direction, it's also more complicated than you think it is, but for me, it's always going to be, I don't really think it matters too much, as XPA sort of, becomes more established and more people think about wanting to make those sorts of beers. I mean, there's hops from all over the world that can suit it. I mean, at one point, XPA had hops from Pacific Northwest, Germany, and Australia in it. So like, I mean, that's the United Nations of hops almost, and obviously there's, you've got all these great New Zealand hops as well, that have their own very, very southern hemisphere, very unique flavors around them too. That I think XPA is one of those beers where you can meld American Pacific Northwest hop, the sort of, to be able to tease out the tropical fruity flavors that those hops have are often more refined than the Southern Hemisphere versions, which tend to be a little bit rawer, a little bit wilder even at times. And that's maybe where the new frontier is, and guys like Blake and that get melding those two together, to get a newer take on it, because you've got brewers these days have an awful lot of hops to choose from. Sometimes it seems like too many, sometimes it seems like you can draw a better picture with 4 colors than 15 maybe,
Yeah.
Say what you want a bit more distinctly, but there's no doubt that there's a real difference between the Southern Hemisphere hops and Northern Hemisphere hops. And,
with some of the modern varieties, whether they're from Pacific Northwest or New Zealand or Australia, I think some of the flavors they're chasing are so sweet. We're not just like citrus, but citrus candy or tropical candy or and I wonder with an XPA, because obviously balance. I mean, you want it to be really drinkable, right? Is it possible to go too cloying with those characters?
Definitely. I've tried a few that have tasted very much like raspberry jello, or something where they've just gone a little bit too far. And when those beers really don't work is where you've got a really, really intensely candied sweet character with a really prickly, ugly bitterness. You get this really horrible clash in the beers where you can see where someone just thought, as people do at times, more actually is more. And I guess that's the word that I haven't mentioned about XPA that is absolutely central to everything is balance. That's the name of the game right there, So you're absolutely right. I think you could definitely go too far down the sweeter confectionery sort of character. You've got to have that balance. And I always wanted mine to have a balance of I used to have my little sensory lab used to be a little VW Congo van or something, like a little delivery van, 2-door delivery van thing. And I used to, when our sales reps weren't driving it, I'd drive it home to Byron every night, and not breaking any drink driving laws either, by the way. But because I'd be on my own, I'd crack a can of XPA off the line that day, and the first thing I'd want to smell is like this beautiful floral character, and then passion fruit, and then mango, and then as you get down to the last half of the beer, the sort of citrusy lime character that I get from a lot of our mosaic would take over. And so, again, with the hops, it'd be a real journey. It wouldn't be just citrus, or it wouldn't be just mango, or it wouldn't be just, strawberry, or, it's about that balance. And for me, XPA at its best is that journey. But people mightn't think like that, but for me, the floral part of it is really, really central to it. I want it to smell perfumey, like I want it to smell like my wife in a way, and she's all dressed up and taking me out to dinner.
It smell,
but with the fruit that's in there as well, because that when you're drinking a pint of that beer, it's that constant evolution in the glass that also makes it so interesting. And to people that aren't brewers or beer nerds or, really especially knowledgeable, I think that was a big part of the success here in Australia, was that people loved drinking this beer, but they didn't even really know why. But subconsciously, it was pushing all these sensory buttons in their heads. And, most folks just went, oh, that doesn't taste like shit, so that's awesome, and they didn't really know why they kept going back again and again. But it was a big part of it was those hop aroma and flavor characteristics, like, balanced really well along with the drinkability and the mouthfeel and the finish in the beer. So.
You mentioned, let's talk about bitterness too, because you mentioned earlier the kettle hops are important.
Yeah.
I think we know that even if IBU for IBU, kettle hops and whirlpool hops do not taste the same. It's not the same kind of bitterness, I think. I always think whirlpool hops are squishy. The whirlpool IBUs are squishy, but you want more structure. So I don't know what sort of level of bitterness would you want, you like to see in an XPA, and how do you work that balance?
Well, like folks have to make their own calculations, but XPA was always about, for me, around 30, 32 BU is what we're looking for. But the thing is that what I've always done is spread it right across, say from a hot side point of view, right across, the entire kettle time. So I've always been a big believer in first wort hops. I was been harassing Blake for the last couple of years about mash hops as well, and I love it. I think if you've got the right varieties of your mash hops, a lot of people are into the whole that it's going to unlock thiols or make more thiols available. For me, if you've used the right varieties, like the SARS-derived varieties, even Mochueka, Rawaka, and SARS, and those ones, that you can actually get surprising benefits to your shelf life in hoppy beers. That was the main reason I do it. But anyway, I'm sidetracking. But so XPA is about spreading that 30, 32, 35 BU right across the entire kettle time from first wort hopping, when the wort's first going into the kettle, through a 60-minute edition, a 15 edition, a 10-minute edition, and then the whirlpool one. And one thing that folks might find surprising is that when I was doing when I first came up with this at a homebrew level, when I scaled the recipe up to, what would you guys say, 30 barrels, so about 35 hectoliter, the whirlpool edition that I was using at home would have calculated up to about 40 kilograms of hops, which is 8 bags or something. And that was going to send us broke then and there, because it would have destroyed our yields, but also would have been wasting an awful lot of whirlpool hops. That I actually fiddled around with that for a while, but I brought that all the way from, like, a direct scale up from 50 litres would have meant 40 kilograms of hops. That became, like, I think 1.5 kilograms of hops. And it's like, that's a huge reduction, huge reduction. But you've got the increase in utilization and an efficiency going from a 50-litre kettle in my garage to a 30-barrel one at work, and that was, to me, that was an indication of how judicious, I wanted to be with those additions, so that's how you get that full saturated hop flavor without any hollowed out bits, out any dips, without any big slaps in the face. So even though they're, a lot of them look like flavor additions, I've never discounted the BU, the bitterness, contribution that they're making, and they all add up. I reckon.
Mm-hmm.
So, because the easy way to do it was always, and I saw a lot of guys, particularly in the US, doing it where there'd be a couple of bags thrown right at the start of boil, and then almost as many hops as you could possibly throw in the whirlpool. and that's it. And then wonder why there was scoops out of the mid palate and why it was everything about the hop character was so heavily weighted towards strident bitterness, not a more refined hop flavour. And for me, that when you can intertwine the flavour with the bittering characteristic is when beer really is at its best from a hop point of view.
Blake, do you want to add any thoughts about hopping balance and XPA?
I mean, honestly, just to mirror exactly what Scotty is saying, I truly believe that hops belong on the hot side. They belong in the kettle. They need to go throughout the entire brew process, from start to finish. I'm not a big mash hop guy. As much as the sensory or the technical data could show, but absolutely first wort through the kettle is 100% essential in my eyes. I came from a brewery where didn't matter what the beer was, it was getting hopped throughout the kettle, and it could be a massive addition, it could just be a little bit, but I guess kind of one of those things as you grow and learn and justify your own processes and your own technique and brew house is I just scaled that back. I scaled it back almost to zero and realized that my beers after a month, if they were still on tap, they tasted like absolutely nothing, because I had no backbone left, and the beer is all just first wort and whirlpool hop or just heavy whirlpool. And once those volatile oils leave the liquid, there's nothing left to stand on because you have no isomerization going. You have nothing in the kettle. You have no hops making a foundation. All you have is malt and then these flavor and aroma hops. So worked my way backwards, and a little bit of hops throughout the boil ends up going a long way, especially for shelf stability and for the lifetime of the beer. You know, if you end up with a beer that you really like, but your patrons or the people at your pub aren't drinking it at the pace you want. You know, I've had beers where I'm like, oh, I really believe in this beer and it's a month old, but I put enough into it and kept it interesting enough. It still tastes really good. It still smells really good. There's the foundation of the beer still exists. And then I've had beers where I've leaned heavy on the modern techniques of only whirlpool, cooling it down to 180 degrees, 190 degrees, trying to keep any and all bitterness out of it. And after about 7 or 10 days on tap, I'm like, there's nothing left in this beer. Like, we should have already sold it all because there's, you know, the beer is gone. There's no backbone, no body to stand on. It's all Pilsner malt based. It's dry as a bone. You have hardly any bitterness. So XPA really redefined the way that I approached West Coast IPA in a sense that it needs hops throughout the kettle. It needs a diversity of bitterness to flavor to aroma balance, and that's where the style really comes in, and that's where it gets interesting because it took a lot of refining to get there. I mentioned earlier, you know, I did many renditions of XPA before landing on the one that was, in my eyes, the right one to commit to competition, to commit to leaning on as kind of more of a core beer. The early ones were definitely more aroma and flavor driven, not much in the kettle. They fell off super fast. There's hardly any alcohol to hold up, you know. When you have a beer that's 5%, and you have no bitterness, it all falls off at the same time. You know, the castle crumbles at the same time. With a West Coast IPA, you know, you have 7.5% alcohol. That alcohol really holds a lot of flavor up, and it keeps the beer stable. The bitterness keeps the beer stable. Your aroma might come down a bit, but at least you have a foundation on. And so with XPA, you know, keep refining each one, and it ended up being this beer that's like got an early kettle edition at, you know, 60 or 45 minutes, and then a mid kettle edition at 30 or 15, a late, and then a good whirlpool, and then really just focusing on a good foundation in that hot side, so that by the time you go to dry hop it, you just pull a sample off the tank and you're like, okay, what more does it need? You're not guessing anymore. You built a foundation of, I got this really nice beer. It's perfectly in my IBU range. It's already got good flavor, good aroma. All I have to do is just add some bouquet arrangement to complete the whole thing. And that was something that I learned just by listening to listening to Scotty and listening to a lot of West Coast IPA brewers that I respect and that have been killing it with awards and stuff.
I want to talk about texture and water. We don't have to go too deep into it, but I think Scotty, you mentioned earlier you're looking for a soft mouthfeel. And I think that might be counterintuitive for some people who are imagining this like really crisp, dry beer. So I'm wondering, like, maybe where is that coming from, the water, that softness, and then how do you work a soft mouthfeel and then get that crisp, dry finish?
I think it's your balance to chlorides to sulfide. I think that's a big one. Yeah, calcium chloride to gypsum ratio. And like, you know, a lot of guys I've seen over there will use big jugs of gypsum, you know, if they need it, if they don't have hard water like Blake does. And they won't use a calcium chloride addition. They'll save all that for their hazies. But, you know, XPA is all about having that balance. And the chlorides are almost like 60, 70% chloride to gypsum sort of ratio, right? So it's obviously going to depend on your own water, but that calcium chloride having a sort of hierarchy over the calcium sulfate thing, I think gives it that initial soft, rounded, fruity mouthfeel, but still allows it to resolve into that crisply dry beer. And that's the magic of it, right? Is it's not just soft or doughy or sweet all the way through, or it's not just brittle and bone dry. It resolves nicely, and the water the water component's a big part of that for me. Anyway, it's always been that. Like every beer, you know, that I'd made at Balter, which was, you know, probably a couple of hundred different ones, but all the core range, everything always had its own separate water profile. I wasn't just adjusting water for the lack of something in the local water supply. It was about actually using those salts to actually enhance or magnify a characteristic in the beer. I almost treat it like a personality thing. Like if you get your salts right, you can add that extra little bit of snap or personality to a beer, depending on what it is, you know. And you got the obvious stuff like, you know, about controlling, you know, your mass pHs when you're making like a stout. So you've got all this really acidic malt, so you don't need to add a bunch of gypsum to those sorts of beers. You want to go, you know, I used like hydrated lime, you know, for that sort of stuff, and actually be trying to raise pHs. with the salts. And just in doing that, the offset of that is also the benefits to the mouthfeel. And the same with the beers, like with XPA. Like if I was making a really snappy West Coast IPA, that chloride range is going to come back down into more balance with the sulfites, which might actually get a bit higher. But it's not going to be, I'll always probably have a little bit of calcium chloride in there to help with that. And like Blake was saying, like as the alcohol goes up, you have also these flavor components from alcohol itself that can fill out some of those spaces. But XPA, like for mine, on our local water up there at the brewery, it needed to have that calcium chloride a bit above, almost like a double the ratio of the gypsum. And it might sound counterintuitive, but that's how you actually get that effect, which I think like that's central, along with the balance and stuff to an XPA, is to have that initial, because that initial, particularly to someone who's not a huge hoppy beer drinker, that initial softness and fruitiness and generosity in that beer disarms people. They're expecting maybe, it's a craft beer, it's apparently hoppy, it's going to rip my head off, or I don't like beers like that, I just drink industrial lager. And then they're disarmed by it straight away. But it resolves and finishes into a finish, I guess, that they're kind of used to anyway. But you've grabbed them by the throat and you've taught them about hops, whether they wanted that or not,
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, basically that kind of comes back around to balance, right? Like that's that balance profile. It's like not super heavy on the chloride, but also not too much of the sulfates, but leaning a little to softness. But
and again, because it's like all these competing factors, and part of it again going back to the malt and having really highly attenuative malt too. Like it's going to be a dry beer. It's just to want to temper that at least a little bit, and of course, like I do obviously additions in the mash, but also in the kettle, and I'm surprised still at the number of brewers sometimes who say, how come you're throwing salt in the kettle as well? It's like, well, because you're going to lose a lot in the mash, right? And a lot of that calcium, gets converted into phosphate, whatever it is, and drops out anyway, and that's how you get your pH change. But like you want particularly some of those chlorides in an XPA to make its way through the kettle.
Yeah.
Into the finished beer.
We haven't talked about dry hopping. Oh, is there anything really that sets dry hopping apart with an XPA as opposed to other?
Probably depends on individual philosophies and stuff. XPA has always been double dry hopped. I do XPA at like day 4, 5, 6, and then the second one would be a minimum of 48 hours after that, and then another minimum of 72 hours before chill back. So, and that's still pretty much the regime up there. Although what we do now is, because in the very early days I didn't have a lab, and I wasn't able to track so closely how the ferments were going. Almost like a 6-hourly or 12-hourly thing, but we'd normally do the first dry hop somewhere under 3 Plato, 2.8 to 3.2. Any higher than that, and then the beer is potentially chasing you back out of the tank, we'd find. So, and then the second one could always be, around 48 hours afterwards. And that seemed to strike a nice balance for us, because what I didn't know way back in the day when I was first doing it, that, the effect that hop creep was going to be having on the beer as well. And I very early on, there's a centennial edition in that first dry hop, and I was blaming on my homebrewed versions, very early, I'd have a beer, taste great, and then after a week or two, I think I'm detecting diacetyl in this beer. And then I'd get the shits about that. And then a few days later, it'd disappear again. And then I was starting to wonder if I was going mad or what it might have been. And then eventually I had an ingredients, one of our suppliers rang me up and asked if I'd been having trouble with USO5 around diacetyl blooms and all this sort of stuff. And by then I'd figured out to separate the dry hops into 2 separate ones, and I'd have an early one, wait 48 hours, do the second one, and by the time the second one was in and just before chillback, the final gravity would have dropped again. And I assumed that it was throwing the hops in, and then that I might have been releasing, if there was CO2 saturated in the beer, in the maturing beer, that you've somehow you've caused the dry hops to sort of maybe agitate the beer and release more CO2 out of solution and allow the yeast to finish off. That there might have been some, that the yeast might have been retarded from finishing by having too high CO2 levels or whatever. What I didn't realise that was the effect of a spike, a diacetyl spike from the hop creep initially, and then it being resolved because I was leaving it enough time in between the dry hops and then between the second dry hop and the chillback for it to finish. And we never really had those issues until we started to get much bigger, and we're forced to try and make the beer get through and in and out of the tanks a bit quicker. And that's where moving for us from gigantic amounts of dry yeast to repitching made a huge difference as well. But
one last thing, at least one. I mean, we can talk about as many things as you want to. I've taken a lot of your time already. When Blake and I talked about XPA, when we talked a few months ago, he was, emphasizing clarity. And then I was in New Zealand over the holidays, and it was very tasty. But I found a hazy XPA, and I'm like, wait a second, this isn't right. That was from Pavel at Mount Brewing, who's a friend of mine. But the beer was great, but it was also like, this is not a crystal clear XPA. So I don't know. Do you guys want to talk about clarity a little bit?
Ours has always had a really light haze in it. And again, part of that being manageable, I think, was the step mashing piece to it. I think it helped have so that the beer would finish clear but not star bright. And I was really determined when we set the brewery up and everything else not to have a flagship beer that I would have to obsess about filtering, because I would find that like a massive bottleneck when you're trying to make, get your brewery going and have a complexity there that, it's a great place to ruin a beer or oxidize a beer or, any other, number of troubles you can have with beer when you add another process to it. So for mine, that all played a part in having a beer that had a really light haze to it. Several years ago, we got to centrifuging the beer and be able to get rid of yeast and still have light protein haze. If your friend was so this was in New Zealand.
Yeah.
There's also quite possibly, people can make XPAs as hazy as they want to, I suppose. There's also the fact, I suppose, if he was using a bunch of Southern Hemisphere hops, and I'm assuming he was using some Kiwi hops. It's remarkable how Southern Hemisphere hops can promote haze stability, right? I often wonder if hazy beers, particularly in this part of the world, would have been such a thing without Southern Hemisphere hops, because I made a beer a few times at Balter, which was a hazy IPA using strictly Australian hops. So that was called Hazy DC. which I thought was pretty
The
funny.
New Zealand beer.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're at Firestone pouring one year, and I very kindly brought Blake along, so he helped me pour some beer, and he kept telling all the locals that we were from New Zealand. That AC/DC was also from New Zealand, so I kicked him out of the tent straight away. Couldn't get rid of him. But that beer, Hazy DC, that was all Australian hops. And like 12 months later, like I'd have retention stock in my fridge at home, and 12 months later, that beer hadn't dropped. Hadn't dropped the yeast cell. It was so thick and hazy. So your friend might have just been using a lot of his own hops.
I think it was intentional, but yeah. Blake, you want to add anything about clarity or haze with XPA?
Yeah, I think there's a couple layers to it, and just from my very simple way of approaching making beer, we're kind of talking about just the base malt in general. It's got a ton of fermentation power to dry out, but that also does come with more protein, and even just the malt itself. When we mill it, you go through the bag, there's a lot more than just the kernel. There's a lot of husk, there's a lot of stem, and this particular malt, and all of that is just protein rich material. So I would say out of all of our hoppy beer, with the protein rich base malt, a little bit of wheat, an earlier dry hop, XPA is definitely the haziest when it comes to transfer day, in all of our West Coast style beer, but takes a little bit more to get it clear. But then once it clears up, it's just like you've had so much material that goes into making the beer hazy. By the time it's clear, you just have this super flavorful and super rich aromatic beer. You had to fight to get it clear, but once it's clear, you're left with this like really, really good end product. And it goes all the way through the thing, like our water treatment isn't as superior as others. It's pretty rudimentary. Filtration is pretty rudimentary. All of these things are just very standard issue. And then once we get to the final beer, leave it in the bright tank for a couple days. We typically try and transfer XPA 4, 5, 6 days before we actually need to package it. Try and get it in the bright, get it carbonated, get it fined, dump the bright tank, almost do a trube dump on it just to keep promoting clarity. And then by the time we package it, we're left with this super nice and clear version. But it's crazy how drastic the beer is from day 0 transfer to package day. And there's just so many internal variables that it comes down to. And like Scotty touched on pretty much all of them, from just simply malt protein to the heavily versioned of hops to the active ferment dry hop. Is all of these things contribute way more than just, old school way of thinking pale ale. You brew this thing and you throw a ton of kettle fining at it. It comes out pretty clear into the fermenter. It ferments, everything flocks out nice and bright. Then you dry hop it, and then you wait for those dry hops to come down, and then you rack off and carbonate. Like XPA is a completely different beast in that you're doing so many different things to this little tiny beer that has to be done to make it an XPA, that you almost need to give it a little bit of extra care and emphasis, as if you would approach a lager. It's so delicate, but you're putting so much at it all at once. One thing that I would touch on when it comes down to dry hopping, like tried so many different dry hop techniques just per Scotty's recommendation, tried doing a double dry hop thing where you throw in some of the heavy hitters a little early, try and get those to really work their way through, and then you hit some of the more aromatic varieties later. I found that the thing that works best for our brew house and our profile is just one good late dry hop. Beer is pretty much at terminal gravity, dry hop it, and then you almost let the diacetyl rest also kind of manicure the hop profile until once you've cleared diacetyl, your hops have done everything that you've also want them to do. And then you just dump all of that together and then start cold conditioning, help promote some of that flocculation, help promote some of that clarity. And you could turn the beer into a, 18 to 21 day quick beer that tastes like it's been conditioned forever because you got rid of so much early on. So
we're obviously just days from World Beer Cup awards being announced, and my fingers are crossed for you, Blake. I know we got bronze in 24, silver last year, this year. I mean, it's the trend. It's the trend line.
Yeah, well, that's as long as Breakside gets gold every year, I'll take bronze or silver.
Yeah.
If that's who's gonna, reign supreme on the podium, bronze or silver is totally fine for us.
Yeah, that's cool.
Just having our names called has been like one of the coolest things, and I always text Scotty right away.
We've covered quite a bit. I'm going to try to sort of bring things to a close here, but I want to ask, because I'm hoping a lot of people will read the article or even hear this maybe and then think, all right, I'm going to brew an XPA. I'm going to do it. So what is there maybe that we haven't discussed, or it could be something that you really want to underscore that somebody who's going to take their stab at an XPA really ought to know and understand?
Again, bring it back to the origins of the beer, why I made it in the first place. Like, if you go, yeah, cool, I'm going to make an XPA, and then you make, 6% beer and you've chucked a bunch of crystal malt in it, you've missed the point. So you've made something else, whatever, a strong pale or something like that. You haven't actually made an XPA. It's about keeping, I really think like keeping the balance of the beer is so super important. And like anyone, as brewers, particularly home brewers, you're sort of often tempted just to push it and go, you know what, I was going to put 100 grams of Citra in there. I'm going to put 200 just because, and more isn't always more. That's a big part of it. It very much, going back to that whole idea of that German sort of attitude and precision that I'd made and developed this beer under it's like sometimes you've got to, you're standing there over the kettle and you got this bucket of extra hops that you're going to throw in, and there's been times where I felt like I've gone and not done it, because I've made, not just with Blake's, I've made a bunch of sort of pale ales and XPA beers over there, with a bunch of folks, particularly up and down the West Coast. And it's amazing sometimes to have to really try and get under their skin and make them understand you don't have to make a 50 IBU XPA. It doesn't have to have 3 metric tons of hops in it. It can be explosively hoppy, and you can do that by using less, just using them more thoughtfully. And particularly because, hops is probably the name of the game. So you want a fully attenuated beer, keep it around 5-ish% if you want to sort of experience what Blake and I experience in this beer. Be disciplined about, and precise about your process. However you make your best beers, use those processes. And yeah, particularly around the hops, consider that, a deft touch is going to go a long way in a beer like this. And you won't make a weak, underpowered, thin, bland, characterless beer. If you put all those components together, in roughly the right order, you're going to get something that's probably going to surprise you about how flavoursome and aromatic and drinkable and satisfying it's going to be. You've just got to loosen the grip and allow that to happen.
There it is. Hope you enjoyed this look at XPA. And for more on the subject, along with an exclusive recipe that Scotty put together for us, check out the next issue of Craft Beer and Brewing magazine. If you're not a subscriber, then go to beerandbrewing.com and remedy that right now. One recipe may be worth the entire year's subscription price. And every issue has 10 to 15 recipes from some of the most interesting and influential brewers anywhere in the world. Also, if you're a pro brewer heading to Philly for CBC, come on out Monday night for a live podcast recording at Union Transfer. If you want a free ticket, just shoot me an email and I'll send you the ticket code. And don't forget to stop by and check out the latest innovations at the G&D Chillers booth 1518 at CBC. Berkeley Yeast's Dry Tropics London offers their best-selling liquid yeast strain with the ease of use of dry yeast. PacTex handles are made from 100% recycled plastic and are fully recyclable. Taste the flavors of indie hops at CBC booth 926 this year in Philly and sample 14 incredible beers. The Midea 50/50 Flex can convert to all fridge, all freezer, or half and half with just the touch of a button. Old Orchard is your one-stop shop for fruit juice concentrates, purees, and blends. ADM brings together science and creativity to elevate taste, quality, and recipe design. Arrived brings together all the tools you need in one complete platform. And the SS Brew Pump from SS Brewtech is engineered to tackle even the messiest brew days. Happy CBC Eve, everyone. See you in Philly soon. Thanks for listening to this one. Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.